So I have been teaching on a kind of particular theme really since the beginning of the year. In the first 6 months of the year, I was leading a monthly full moon ceremony, which comes out of the Zen tradition, but it was really rooted in the early Buddhist Sangha. And it was a tradition in which the monks and nuns would come together on the brightest night of the month, which was the full moon, and the darkest night of the month, which was the new moon. And they would retake their vows. And it's a beautiful ceremony that I did for many, many years in my early Zen training. And I use the framework of the ceremony to kind of offer a series of teachings. And we also did the ceremony. And if you're interested in hearing those talks, they're available on my website, which is pamelaweiss.com. But they're all there and free, and you can hear them if you want. And more recently, the last month, I've been teaching a class about living by vow. And so the theme of living by vow, which was rooted in that full moon ceremony, and that next week is the last week of the class, I thought I would share with you some of my reflections, and it's been very rich territory for me, kind of traversing this idea of what does it mean to live in a way that is intentional? What does it mean to live in a way that we are in alignment with what we care most about? What the Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki Roshi used to call the heart's inmost request. This is very much the heart's inmost request is at the center of spiritual life and walking a spiritual path. So I'll back up a little bit and give some context here, which is a little bit about what it means to walk a spiritual path. And many of you probably have heard this very simple phrase, which is attributed to the Buddha, although I've been told he never really said it. I think that's actually true of a lot of things that we attribute to the Buddha, because I've probably said to you many times, nothing was written down that the Buddha spoke for 400 years. It's a long time. And if you read the early Buddhist texts that were recorded, you'll see that many of them are kind of like lists of things. And there's a lot of repetition. And that's because the teachings were offered in an oral tradition for a long, long time. But it's hard to know if, you know, that game telephone we used to play. Something was said, and then it was said, and then it was said, and then it was said. So who knows if by the time it got written down, it was exactly what the Buddha said. Hopefully it maintained the spirit of what the Buddha said, but I don't know if it was the exact words. So the phrase that I enjoy and have been told the Buddha said this, and also no, he never said that, is this. The Buddha said, I teach one thing and one thing only: suffering and the end of suffering. So I find this very helpful because it offers an orientation. There are so many things that the Buddha could have focused on and taught about, but for him, that was the central question. For him, that was the center of why we engage in spiritual life. Perhaps we come in out of our own suffering, or perhaps we're touched by the suffering of the world. And we want to know, what do we do? How can we help? Some people come to spiritual life just because they're curious or it sounds cool. But for many, many of us, we come in through what I call the dukkha door. Certainly true for me. And this simple suffering and the end of suffering phrase is fleshed out in what many of you know well or have learned about as the Four Noble Truths. There is the first truth of suffering, of dukkha. There is the second truth, which is the cause of suffering, which is sometimes, I think, a little bit mistranslated as grasping or thirst. And I'll say more about that in a moment. There's the third truth, which is that it's possible to be free of suffering. This is widely misunderstood, I believe. Again, I'll say more to try to explain. And finally, the fourth truth is that there's a way, there's a path that we can follow. And I'll be talking about that some more as well. So dukkha is vast. Dukkha means everything in, the range of our experience from what we might think of as mild irritation or sadness or melancholy or boredom to full on, whatever it is, grief, rage, distress, humans, we're so finely tuned, finely wired, and we have within our experience so much of a range of what's possible for us to see and hear and taste and touch and feel. But no one gets away with being human without some suffering. And this is the essence of the first noble truth. The Buddha didn't say life is suffering. He said there's suffering in human life. A lot of times I wonder, why did he say something so obvious? But I think that he said it because most of us, when we meet suffering, turn away. And he put that as the first noble truth because he's asking us to turn, to look, to face, to feel, not to get mired in, not to get bogged down by. But he recognized that trying to avoid suffering just makes it worse. And the story of the Buddha's own path, as many of you know, includes this story of the heavenly messengers, that he himself was struck, his heart was tenderized by seeing these messengers of old age, sickness, and death, which really represent this kind of existential truth for us as human beings. No one will get away with avoiding old age, sickness, and death. There's an old phrase that we used to use in my Zen training, which was something like, you have two options. You'll either die suddenly, or you'll get older and sicker and then die. So this is part of the deal with being human, and yet most of us either pretend away or don't want to look or don't want to think or like that. And so putting this first noble truth front and center was intentional, I think, on the Buddha's part. He said, no, let's begin to not that we will, this goes to the second truth, it's not that we will end suffering, meaning there will never be any difficult experience, or that sickness will go away, or pain will go away, but we can change our relationship to it. That's the second noble truth. The third noble truth, the second noble truth is to understand how it is that we don't do that. That instead of turning towards suffering and shifting our relationship to it, we're in a constant state of grasping and aversion. And this is sort of I think of the suffering as really having three parts. There is the impact of suffering, which is when there's unpleasant experience, we push it away. There's the flip side of that. It's kind of like the opposite side of the coin, which is that when there's pleasant experience, we grab on. And this is what's emphasized in that second noble truth, tanha, grasping. But really what's being pointed to is not just that we grasp to pleasant experience, but also that we reject, we push away unpleasant, that those two things are going on habitually all the time, every moment, really, every moment that we're not awake. We're in the grips of grasping and aversion. And at the center of grasping and aversion is understood to be this truth that the reason that we do this is because we are confused, because of ignorance. I find this to be very encouraging. In the tradition that I grew up in, there was much more of an emphasis on, sort of original sin. That you get born into being human and there is already trouble. And the Buddhist premise is really the opposite, that we're born with Buddha nature, but that as we age, as we grow up, as we get acculturated, that we lose contact with something that we all know very deeply inside us, which is this truth of our non-separation. We know when we're younger, we can feel the unified field of relationship and connectivity. And then as we get older and we individuate, which is a healthy psychological phase to go through, we take that very seriously and we really start to believe, especially if you've grown up in American culture, that this thing called independence and being separate from everything else and having your own separate identity is where it's at. And I'm not suggesting that that's not a good and useful thing. But what happens is that as we do that kind of individuation, we forget. We lose contact with something that is going on that's also true, which is that we're also connected. And this is part of the radical reorientation of the path, is that we no longer have to abide in an either or kind of mind. Either I'm separate or I'm connected. But bit by bit, as we drop down, as we practice in our meditation, we drop down from the mental fabrication. What's that word? Papancha. You guys know that great word? Papancha means mental proliferation. So the mind is constantly proliferating. You've probably noticed. And the mind is also very much, it likes things to be this or that. Yes or no, good or bad. But when we begin in our practice to drop under the level of cognition, of mental papancha, we enter a realm where things are much more fluid, where there's the possibility that it's not this or that, but that two things can happen that seem different, seem opposite in the mind, but can actually be happening at the same time. For example, sometimes grief, which the mind thinks this is not a good thing, is actually so beautiful in a certain way. So it's just a simple example that in our direct experience, things that the mind holds to be separate, distinct, opposite even, often in our experience, they're not so separate. So this is the healing that happens. And it doesn't mean we have to get rid of the mind or criticize it in some way. We just want to see that it has its place, but it's not the whole story. Because when we lose contact with that deeper truth of our connectivity, we suffer. We lose contact with a sense of meaning. We can begin to feel alienated or isolated. Or if we look out in the way it's playing out in the world, we see tremendous divisiveness, right? It's this or it's that. It's red or it's blue. It's good or it's bad. You're a sinner or you are saved. And there's no room for this inclusivity, many flavors of life. This feels especially important to say today, which was the Pride March in San Francisco, and it's part of Pride Month, which is, if nothing else, and it is many things, a celebration of all kinds of shapes, colors, forms of humanity expressing itself. So how do we get from this realm of suffering and grasping and aversion and confusion to the third truth, which is that there's this possibility of freedom? And again, it's important to say that freedom doesn't mean that you will find yourself on what I always call the island where it all works out, which is the fantasy version in our minds, which is the place where there's only pleasant experience and no longer unpleasant experience. That's not what it means. Remember, what we're doing is not trying to change our experience, but to change our relationship to our experience. That's what freedom means. It means when difficult experience arises, I don't have to make it worse. And when pleasant experience arises, I don't grab on in such a way that I throttle it, that we can actually show up in the fullness of each moment, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant or something in between. We give ourselves to our life in its fullness, the full expression of life. So the way that we do this, according to the Buddha, is through what's called the Eightfold Noble Path. The fourth truth, Magga, is the path. And this is the lead-in to what I want to talk about as the second step on the path, which is wise intention. So the path is divided into three sections. The first is the wisdom section. The second is the sila, that sort of ethical behavior section. And the third is the place of bhavana or mind training. It's really the place of meditation. And it's interesting to me that in much of Western convert Buddhism, we've kind of reduced the whole Eightfold Path to step number 7 out of 8, which is mindfulness. And there's probably nobody in San Francisco anyway, very few people who haven't heard of mindfulness, right? But mindfulness is just one step in this whole program that the Buddha laid out for us. And it's an important one. But I want to say a little bit about the first two steps, because those I think are really essential for making sure that as we pick up all of the other steps on the path, that we're doing it with, well, the first step of the path is what's called wise view or wise understanding. That our orientation is the orientation in the right direction. Yeah. And wise view or wise understanding, it kind of goes in a circle back to the Four Noble Truths, or back to the orientation of wise understanding is suffering and the end of suffering. That's the orientation of the path. That's the Buddha saying where we begin on the path is with suffering. We pick it up rather than push it away. And what deepens as we move through the various other stages of the path is our capacity to step into the end of suffering. All of the path is a kind of skillful means. I think of it sometimes as the whole path is just a deepening of that first step, because our understanding can start in a very cognitive way. But as we actually pick up all of the other steps of the path, that cognitive understanding gets embedded in our bodies, in our actions, in our speech, in our relationships, and it deepens and deepens through our meditative practice or practices. So for me, this wise view or wise understanding is in some ways both the beginning and the end of the path. I often think of the path itself as more of a circle than a line. And some of you may know it's often represented as a wheel, that each of the steps of the path is a spoke on the wheel. And that the turning of that wheel is a reorientation for all of us. A reorientation from separation to connection, from I, me, and mine to us, from divisiveness to connectivity, from fear to love. You can tell as I talk about it why it takes a lifetime at least, and maybe why there's so many steps. It's a big project, but certainly a worthy one. So wise intention is the second step. And I often think of it like wise view as if you're standing at the top of the mountain and you can see the territory. This is the willingness to turn toward suffering, to see it for what it is, in ourselves, in others, to not look away, to allow the heart to quiver. And then wise intention, once we're standing on the top of the mountain, is the direction we turn to walk the path. It's our North Star in a way. Intention is about aligning ourselves with what matters most. First, we see clearly, and then we say, here, this is the way I want to go. And this is important because most of us don't live so much intentionally. And if you do, please forgive me for suggesting otherwise, but I would say most of us are living much more in a kind of habitual karma, right? We're living in this state of reactivity with pleasant and unpleasant experiences coming at us 24/7. And on one side, either liking, wanting, grasping or not liking, not wanting, pushing away. And believe me, if I thought this strategy would work, I would just say go for it. But at least what I've seen for myself, and actually many other people, is that it doesn't work out very well. That the strategy of grasping an aversion, of trying to get and get away from, it doesn't get us to some freedom. It just makes us tired. Have you noticed? It's like you're in a constant state of effort, actually. So instead, we can begin to clarify for ourselves intention. What is the heart's inmost request? We can begin to clarify for ourselves what is really important. What am I willing to take a stand for? And for me, part of the way that I am supported in doing this is to begin by looking around and seeing who inspires me. Who are those people who've done just that? And you may have your own list, but over the years, I have a whole file of talks that I've given about particular people who inspire me. So maybe it's Martin Luther King, or one of my great heroes, Brian Stevenson, or Fannie Lou Hamer, or Gandhi, or Mandela. One of the talks that I found in my long list of people, was a talk that I gave about the poet Mary Oliver, who I saw some years ago live, and as many of you know, is no longer living. But I'm going to share a piece of a poem from her that someone gave me. It was one I hadn't heard before. She is a great Buddhist teacher, I believe. So this, for me, is one of the ways that I talk about a simplified version of a spiritual path, is 3 steps, which are inspiration. So we take in, we breathe in something, someone, some word, some place that inspires us. This is part of the story that often gets left out in the story of the Buddha. We hear a lot, there's 4 heavenly messengers, and we hear a lot about the first 3, which are old age, sickness, and death. But there's a 4th messenger. And that 4th messenger was, in many ways, the inspiration for Gautama Siddhartha to become the Buddha. And what he saw was a monk, a wandering sadhu, who was strolling back and forth under the shade of a tree. And he was struck by the beauty, the peacefulness, the serenity of this being. And it touched something in him. So you may reflect now as I'm speaking and consider, was there something that touched you, that led you to begin to practice? I've asked this question many, many times of many, many people. And it's so interesting what it is. Sometimes it's a friend told me about something, or I read a book, or I heard a talk. Sometimes I've heard people describe, I was traveling and I went to this temple and I walked inside and something, I felt something. So there may be one instance, there may be many for any of you, but this is important to remember, because the thing that touches us out there wouldn't touch us if what was being touched wasn't also in here. That resonance. There's something that lights something up. We breathe it in and something comes alive. Just in the same way that the heart quivers, it's described with compassion in the face of suffering. The heart is also, it tingles, it resonates when we feel a sense of inspiration. This is such an important piece for us in our practice. And probably in the spirit of the path itself being a circle, being a wheel, it may be that we need to return to those sources of inspiration over and over again. So when we are inspired, in my version, this 3-step version of the path, inspiration, then the next part is aspiration. This is close to wise intention. Something is touched in us, and then we say, oh, I want something. And we may not even know what it is exactly. It may just be a feeling that we say, oh, this way. That was very true for me when I was in my 20s when I first showed up at San Francisco Zen Center, and I wanted to meditate, although I didn't really know why. I knew I was suffering a lot. And I'd heard that this might be a good idea. And what I remember were in this paradoxical way, there's two things happening at once. My mind was like, this place is so weird, right? These bald people and long black gowns and drums and incense. And I was like, very critical mind. But something touched me very deeply that had me keep coming back. And I didn't really know what it was. I just knew that some part of me was like, yes, that. And maybe because I was young, or maybe because I was suffering enough, I was wise enough to follow. So this aspiration, this, what is it that pulls me, that calls me, that touches me? It's a very tender exploration. And in the class that I have been teaching on living by vow, we were just in the point in the class where I was asking everyone to reflect for themselves on their own aspiration, to begin to clarify for themselves, what is it? What is their vow? And I recognized that for me, it's very raw. And it is, I think, very much because of that. It's at the heart of spiritual life. And what I mean by that is, for so many of us, if we've felt that resonance, something has touched us, something has called us, something's woken up in us that said, oh, I want to go to hear a talk at SFI on Sunday night, or I want to go and meditate, or I want to go, whatever it is. It's very likely that that place has been in you for a long time. But for many of us, that kind of aspiration, the wishing, the dreaming, the wondering, the wanting gets crunched down. Life has its way. of taking a kind of purity and innocence and really a kind of nascent love that we all come in with and telling us, you need to grow up, be reasonable, be rational. Who's going to pay the rent? Who's going to pay the taxes? Who's going to take care of the kids? And these are important. It's important for us to be able to take care of ourselves, but it's also important for us to nurture and tend this part of the heart. And I think for me, at its essence, this is what spiritual life is inviting us back to, inviting us to open that tenderness in ourselves and to turn toward, rather than kind of covering over and moving away, moving along, speeding up in some way. And even if you didn't have that kind of, I'll use a strong word, but if you didn't have that kind of beaten out of you, by in your childhood or in your schooling, we live in such a difficult, fraught system, We have these systems of hierarchy and racism and misogyny. We can't help but being impacted by all of that and have it harden us in some way. It doesn't always feel safe to really touch. What is it? What is it I really care about? So I want to say a little bit about this in a personal way to you, because I'm inviting you to reflect on this for yourself. And it seems only fair that if I'm asking you to do it, that I would share a little bit. And the way that I invited people to reflect on their personal vow, their intention, their aspiration, was to begin from a place of inspiration. And this for you could be what drew you to practice. It could be something or someone who inspires you now. And for me, the person who I've been carrying with me is Yasodhara. Yasodhara was the Buddha's wife. And she is a figure who has been largely written out of Buddhist history. In the Pali Canon, she's rarely even referred to by her own name. She's referred to as the mother of Rahula, who was Yasodhara and the Buddha's son. But I've been carrying her inspiration with me because I've done a bunch of research, and there are stories about how it is that Yasodhara walked a parallel path with the Buddha. That when he left home and went out to the wilderness, as it were, to find his spiritual path, that she stayed home. And that she cultivated an equal path with the Buddha, raising their son, tending the hearth, caring for the garden. And in my mind, this is confession here, but in my mind, her teachings are kind of the lost teachings. I'm quite sure that they didn't get written down, and we don't know what they are. But it is part of my vow and my aspiration to really bring on board and search and explore this path of living in the world as a householder and being fully dedicated to practice. This has not been yet very well developed in Western convert Buddhism. We have a rather nascent Buddhism here in the West and in California and in San Francisco, which has cultivated quite well and beautifully these monasteries and retreat centers and periods of long retreat, but we haven't really figured out this other part yet. And I don't really imagine that we will in my lifetime. But I feel committed to doing what I can to try to discover what that means and to look for ways to invite people who are living in the world into a full spiritual life, including myself. And exactly what I'm inviting tonight, which is this reflection on intention, aspiration, vow. This is, I think, one of the key pieces of what it means to live a life, a spiritual life, as a lay person, as a householder. Because the world is coming at us with so much stuff all the time. And if we don't have some place that we can say, oh, this is the direction I want to go, this is what matters to me, we just get swept, right? I do. By whatever the latest news cycle drama might be. And I don't suggest that we should stick our heads in the sand and not pay attention to what's going on in the world, but also, it's that both and again, also that we find our vow, we find what we really deeply care about, and that this vow isn't, something written in stone. I like to say it's a living vow. It's something that gets to change and adapt as we do. So I often like to say my vow is not written in stone, it's written in water. It's fluid. The important part is to be in the inquiry, much more than like getting the final product. I've crafted the perfect vow. But to know this is the direction, this is what I care about, or at least to wonder.